Greetings, everyone, and welcome back to Mounds and Memory, a podcast about the history and archaeology of death, burial, the afterlife, belief, and ritual in the Viking Age. Once again, I am joined by my wonderful colleague Howard Williams, and today we're going to continue our exploration of the mystical and fascinating Iceland. After last time's discussion on horse burials, today we're going to try to untangle the very complicated history of Iceland's conversion to Christianity.
Yeah, so we've got that 130 years of formal pagan in which there's whole questions about to what extent it was wholly or fully pagan without a Christian intervention. But then we have this whole question of, was there a moment of conversion? And the thing that archaeologists and historians tend to agree on is the idea of a moment or an event of conversion is not something most people take seriously. Most scholars are more happy to think about long processes, both preceding a formal date, which is remembered, and afterwards. These are, if anything, open-ended processes in some ways, and that often many societies are back projecting what they think makes them Christian, and what they and the things that they perhaps gave up were perhaps very limited, or they perhaps were never something they did in the first place. So there's a whole question about, I think we're interested in is how death rituals in particular fit into how conversion happened, but also how it's remembered as happening, which can be something different again.
Yes, because we have these multiple perspectives. We have the institutionalized perspective that I'm going to be discussing now, the Ari Þorgilsson's Íslendinga book and other sources. And then we have the more personal experience, which is harder to retrieve, and maybe archaeology can tell us a little more on that, because as we know, the later sagas are kind of filtered through the Christian lenses, so they're a little bit subjective. But I also think we have to draw a difference between conversion and Christianization, with Christianization being like this whole process of institutionalized acceptance of a particular religion. And then we have the conversion, which would be like this more lived religious experience in a way.
I think that's a very helpful distinction, isn't it? And it helps us to think about the lived experience versus the institutional. Yeah, I think that's very useful.
It is, and that is why I'm going to try to present to you a little bit the Book of Icelanders, written by Ari Þorgilsson, because he is or at least he is perceived as the absolute authority on the conversion, which has some problems of its own. And then we also have the story of the conversion, Kristni saga, and also some references in later sagas, such as the saga of Njol, Laxfella saga, Olafs saga, Tryggvasonar in Mesta, and other sources. But yeah, let's have a look at Ari Þorgilsson's book first. This is a very short story. It is a very compact history of Iceland, and he devotes quite a lot to Christianization of the, I think 4,000 words he writes in total. I think 800-900 are dedicated to this particular process. So his story was written sometime between 1122 and 1133, and from the very beginning he mentions his sources. And what is interesting for us to know is that he was sort of close to the future bishops of Iceland, so he would have had a subjective perception of its own, because he was fostered by a person called Hatl, who was involved in the process of Christianization, and the same person was also the foster father of the son of Isleifur, who was the first bishop of Iceland. So he does have this very personal approach. Yeah, but he does try to maintain objectivity in his writing. I mean, he does focus a lot on the legal and political process, unlike the other sources which tend to also draw on the supernatural or the miraculous, hagiographical writing, and so on. He tries to be more or less objective, right?
And can I just say, in comparative terms, most. I mean, I'd love your view on this. Maybe I'm wrong. Surely, in comparative terms with other parts of Europe, there are very few sources that give us whatever we think of the historicity, the granular nature of these sources are certainly more richer than many other places. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And what's also interesting is that the story we have tries to present itself as very coherent,
Yeah.
which is a bit of a question mark in itself, because this is like the authoritative version we have at our disposal, but maybe there would have been other versions as well. There is also Adam of Bremen's version. I'm going to talk a little bit about later, because it is somewhat different than what we have in Icelandica book in terms of the links to the higher authority, because Adam of Bremen insists that Isleifur was consecrated by the bishopric of Hamburg-Bremen, and it would have been in his interest to make such claims. But anyway, the core story has to do with a priest called Thangbrand, who is sent to Iceland by Olaf Tryggvason, and he manages to convert some people, such as Halld, I mentioned before, Hjalti and Gissur the White. However, the majority of population rejected Christianity. And after 1 or 2 years, Thangbrand left Iceland, but not before killing some people who insulted him. And then upon returning to Norway, he complains that this country is beyond anything you can imagine. We cannot convert these pagans. And Olaf Tryggvason gets really angry, and he threatens to kill all the Icelanders he had at court. Because as we know, Norwegians also had Icelanders as court, especially as poets. It would have been very, very practical. And then to solve this crisis, we have the people who converted, who Thangbrand managed to convert, and these people said, you know, if you leave the Icelanders alive, we are going to go back to Iceland, and we're really going to try to convince the whole population to convert. And Hjalti has some problems of his own, because when they gather at the Althing, he utters a verse where he calls Froya a bitch, which was not really something you would have wanted to hear. And he is convicted of lesser outrage. And then the crisis becomes even more severe. The two parties start gathering around, gathering supporters, and they, however, do not end up in a total war, because in the end they sort of like negotiate an agreement, and that agreement involves very much the law speaker, the lögsogumaður Þorgeir Þorkelsson, and the story of how he comes to the conclusion that Iceland should become Christian is very interesting in itself. It's also in some way a little bit mystical, because not only Ari's version but also the other sources tell us that he lay under his cloak for an entire day and night in contemplation, and following this contemplation and mystical experience, he realized the danger of discord in society, and he warns the people that if we tear apart the law, we are also going to tear apart the peace. So he urges the assembly to just accept Christianity, and on the other hand, they are allowed to practice their cults individually or in their families, but just not in an official manner, because the official religion should be Christian. And Thorgeir himself was a pagan, but according to the story, he realized the importance of having the same law in order to preserve peace. So, like I said, there were some heathen concessions, not only the possibility to practice secret sacrifice, but also they were still allowed to eat horse flesh, and also to expose children. Now, Ari mentions that these practices were also abolished a couple of years later. Whether that actually is true is really hard to say. All this information can be found in chapter 7. So here it is written that the Christians and the heathens declared under separate laws from the other, and then they left the law rock, and then he continues describing these tensions in society and how they came to the conclusion that Thorgeir, so the law speaker, is the one who should decide for all the people. And the conclusion would be that þó komið hagmanna í ónýtt efni, ef menn skildi eigi hafa allir lög ein og landi her og taldi fyrir mönnum og marga vega. So people's affairs have come to a bad pass if they were not able to have the same law in this country. So this is Ari's opinion about the conversion. And yeah, like I said, he does credit the source of his comprehensive account to his foster father Tater, although yeah, his foster father was actually Haller, so the other foster father called Tater would have been more like of a tutor type of thing. So at any rate, he insists on the fact that he has this information from eyewitnesses and from reliable accounts. Also interesting is what he does afterwards. In the book, he lists a lot of foreign bishops who come visit Iceland, including some bishops from Armenia, surprisingly. Yeah, so I think he wants to point out the fact that Iceland is no longer isolated and is actually participating in this larger Christian picture. And maybe he also wants to distance himself a little bit from the Norwegians, which was understandable at the time. Yeah. Right. And he mentions that the first bishop consecrated in Iceland is someone called Isleif, the son of Gissur the White I mentioned earlier.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And he had these three sons, one of them being Tater, the one he actually grew up with at the farm of the same Haller. So the son of Isleif, is actually the one who was the most popular, and it is told that he was guided by some law speaker to make a law for everyone, including a census. So with Christianity, we have the first census in Iceland, so that is already proof that the country was beginning to be a little more structured and organized, and that was done with the purpose of collecting taxes, of course. Right. Two episcopal sees were established. The first one in Skolholt, so the one established by Gissur, and then he donated some of his fortune, some of his diocese, in order to form the other see in the north, the bishopric of Hólar. So this source does look like history, but we can say in a way it also functions like a myth, a sort of foundational document for Icelandic society, because this is like a milestone. Also, if you read the sagas, you're going to notice that we have a couple of milestones, such as the settlement would be the first one, the conversion would be the second one, and the third one would be the loss of independence. And it's also interesting that at the very beginning of his history, he mentions the Papar, so the Irish monks that would have wandered about the island at some point, and he insists a little bit on this aspect, I think, with the purpose of showing that, yeah, you see, we have these Christian elements from the very beginning in society, so we can link them all together. Although the Book of Settlements,
is that the idea then that like the Irish are not being gifted a conversion role, but their very presence is like kind of a foreshadowing? Is that
sort
the
of
idea?
Yeah.
Right. Thank you. That's really helpful. Yeah.
Yeah. Because he tries to show that Christianity was set in the more distant past than was the case. The Book of Settlement tells us a little bit tells us a different story in a way, in the sense that some people were Christian, some people were pagan who arrived to Iceland, but most of them sort of like devolved to paganism in the end. But Ari, he has this idea that even from the very beginning, as a history of origins, this would have made sense for Iceland to be Christian as well. So in a way, the whole book functions as a sort of like foundational document for Icelandic society, in the sense that it tries to shed the best possible light on Iceland's past, including the pagan past. And I think that at the time it was written, so in the 12th century, it really was considered history, but later on it assumed like this mythical dimension. And we have a couple of elements here that speak for that, like core concerns, that narrative patterns. For example, as John Lindo pointed out, just like the Norse gods created an ordered cosmos in early mythology, Ari describes the establishment of law and the Christianization as the foundations of the new Icelandic society. So in that sense. And he also insists on the role of knowledge in that matter. So knowledge of the origin, knowledge of the cosmos, and so on. So he tries um, to present us this history as being the guiding principle of Icelandic history in a way. But yeah, this is not the only account. We have some other accounts, of most important one being perhaps the story of conversion, Kristni saga. And Kristni saga has always been criticized in research as not being as accurate as Ari's account, or not being as objective as Ari's account, which is more or less the case. It has more details. At any rate, it seems to have involved some supernatural and mystical elements as well. Stories of miracles, although it tries to downtone them in order to focus on the important things as well. So we do have hagiographical dimension to it, in the sense that the missionaries are described, and not only Thangbrandr, but also the missions of Thorvald, Stepnir, Friedreker, and others. The story Kristni saga presents is quite a violent one, again involving insults between pagans and Christians, and in total he mentions at least 18 killings. And the spiritual elements are also very much present. For example, there is an episode where Haller, we mentioned before in Icelandic saga, is converted after being moved by the sight and sounds of Christian rites, which bring the sounds of bells and the scent of incense, and the men clothed in costly material, which is a very interesting detail, because in the end, this new religion was also a gift. When you got baptized, you received some gifts, and the religion itself can be considered as a sort of exotic gift, a gift that might give you the opportunity to connect with the more prestigious powers of Europe, right? Yeah. We also have some couple of miraculous interventions, such as some people defeating some berserkers who oppose them by destroying their immunity to fire. Although this saga tries to downplay on that episode, as well as on others. What's very interesting is that we even have some pagan skaldic verses included, which I'm very happy about, especially because the poet cited is actually a poetess by the name of Steinunn Revsudottir. And she basically mocks the Christian missionary Thangbrandr by saying that his ship was shattered by Thor, who threw it from land while Christ was not watching. As violence was expressed also verbally, so also physically, but also verbally. I find very interesting, this tension.
I like that sort of sense of sort of like a sort of face-off kind of rap battle,
exactly.
sort of between these.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And one does wonder, okay, and this is something totally speculative, and you can tell me how that's rubbish, whether the interactions with Christian missionaries would have had predecessors in, more, should we say, less perhaps fundamental, but still dialogues between which deity pagans preferred, and Thor did this to you because of one wonders whether there was a pagan predecessor to this. I don't know if we have any evidence of that. People would have dialogue with each other, maybe not.
People in dialogue with each other, you mean over which god was more important?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that is actually interesting, because we have a poem describing a verbal duel between Thor and Odin.
Of course, yeah. Yeah.
So I think this was really embedded in society, like this game of insults and
Yeah.
this game of poems, also riddles. So this whole verbal duel that was
Mm.
very much part of the culture, and I think it fit very well this general picture. Feuding, also based on what you said to other people, and insults were regarded very seriously. I mean, if someone insulted you, you even had the right to kill them. So yeah, a good integration, in other words. Right. So what we can also say about Kristi Saga is the reaction of the Norwegian crown again. So here we have similarities to Ari's story, in the sense that Olaf Tryggvason reacts angrily to the report of failure, and what is different, however, is the fact that Thangbrandr in this account is also being more severely criticized by the fact that he was himself very unjust and unruly, and this is why he got outlawed. And because also he resorted to very serious measures, such as killing some people. And also interestingly, the new converts, they insist on Thangbrandr not having managed to convert that many people because he was a foreigner. So I think again we can see this tension, this political tension going on between Norway and Iceland at the time. Some other interesting details I've noticed is the idea of a victory offering. So the saga details the escalating tension at the Althing, where Christians and heathens gathered fully armed. And to counter the heathens' plan to sacrifice two people from each quarter, Gissur and Hjalti requested a so-called victory offering of two Christians from each quarter. And they motivated that by saying that, you pagans, you always pick the worst people possible and then you sacrifice them. But this time we are going to pick like the good ones, and we are going to offer them to God, which has led some scholars to put forward the idea that this might have had a sacral dimension, like this whole idea of sacrifice, like offering
Yeah.
people. Yeah, a little bit of heathen influence here as well, suspected. But the outcome is actually the same. So Icelanders are still allowed to perform their normal sacrifices in secret, as long as they're in secret. And he also, so the author of the Kristni Saga also mentions that these practices were abolished a few years later, which is something very difficult to
Yeah.
verify. And I don't think we have any strong evidence for them disappearing completely. I mean, we do know that in other parts of Scandinavia, they continued a long time
Mm.
after Christianization, and what people did privately, it's very difficult to tell. And then there is always the focus on Isleifur and his son Gissur. They would have been very important because they were the ones who conducted the institutionalization of Christianity in Iceland. And there is also the idea that legal stability would have been the most important thing when deciding on such matters.
All enshrined in the law and order of the Icelandic world, isn't it? It's about stability and structure. That seems to be so. At least that's what I get the impression of.
Yep. Yep. And regarding Kristni Saga, like I said, there has been this tendency of not considering it as serious as Ari's account, but this has also been questioned in an article by Shane Grunley, for example, in 2002, which states that this story should also be considered a more or less objective one, at least in comparison to Ari, because the author, although he does include some supernatural elements, some miracles, and so on, he tries to downplay them and not insist too much on them. So he tones it down. And also he emphasized for intentions, and he offers like this more national narrative in contrast to a more localized perspective of Ari, who would have been very much influenced by his personal relationships with this family. So he also includes a lot of genealogical and topographical information. So, for example, when we have this whole story of Thangbrand killing two people, it is described in very great detail where that actually took place. So we kind of have an idea about that somewhere in Borgarfjordur, and we have the name of the beach, for example, the name of the hill where the battles took place. And it is also mentioned that they built mounds there for the people who were killed, and these mounds would have still been visible. So he really tries to lend us this impression that we are talking about a history and it's not just hearsay or a compilation. So he tries to be accurate one way or another by including all these details that some of them we cannot find elsewhere, such as the topographical information in connection to Thorbrand's killings.
So for Christian societies, for the Christian era as it emerges, mounds are landmarks, mnemonics that refer to, whether it's as simple as this or not, they become pagan. They become seen as the dead from before, but specifically some graves may have actually been linked to the story of conversion itself. That's really interesting.
Yes, indeed. Now, if you think about it, Harald Bluetooth, when he buries his father, he tries to design this grave in a very pagan style, which I think at the time would have also seemed a little old-fashioned with this huge mound and so on. And afterwards, he moves him to church.
It's an archaism, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's a deliberate. I mean, it's an acute attempt at hyper-conservatism, if that's another word that
Yeah, it's a little antiquarian, and I think at some point pagans were also trying to emulate what they saw Christians doing from this point of view, of trying to construct a community by using all these elements, so including the way they perceived and constructed the graves and the whole narrative surrounding death, I suppose. So the problem with most of the sources we have about conversion is the fact that transmission is sometimes hard to trace. And from this point of view, Ari Thorkelsson does have an advantage because in his case, we can actually trace the text. But Kristi Saga, I think, is also a very good source to find out a little more about the history of Christianization in Iceland. There is also this topos of the good heathen. The author mentions a couple of times. So the idea that some of the heathen attacks on the Christians are actually the result of legal conflicts and not necessarily because of religion or because of ideology. Right. So we do have the impression that the compiler did rework the sources according to the historical principles that Ari was following as well.
Oh, intriguing.
Yeah. And okay, I have one example supporting what I said before, that the supernatural elements are not really as heavily represented as in other sources and in other missionary hagiographical histories. So there is this idea that that the father of one of the missionaries called Thorvald had an encounter with a heathen spirit, and his father converted after sort of like battling the spirit, but then in Kristi Saga this is largely exposed as imagination, so it's something not really taken seriously. And it's the same, and it's the same thing with another episode where there are some heathens trying to attack the first church that was built in the north of the island, and in another story called Thorvald's Dotter, it is said that they did not do that because they saw a big fire and they started feeling a big heat, and they believed actually believed that the church was on fire. It all looks very, very real, but in Kristi Saga this was exposed as imagination. So the heathens, they were just imagining that that church was on fire, and that's why they decided that, yeah, it's going to be burnt anyway, so let's move on from there. So he does present a little bit of skepticism regarding these miraculous stories, which speaks a lot for his objectivity, more or less, or at least in comparison to other sources. Right. So these are the two most important sources, Icelandic book and Kristi Saga. However, we can also find references to other sources, in other sources as well. In Njord Saga, there is, for example, a very similar story. So it is basically the same story presented in Ori, with the law speaker who spent day and night covered in his cloak. But then we also have some stories that insist on other aspects of the conversion, such as the Olaf Saga Tryggvasonar and Olaf Saga Tryggvasonar en Mesta. Olaf Tryggvason is presented as a very violent king, but at the same time that is completely justified because he is on a good cause. What is very interesting in the later source, in the greater saga of Olaf Tryggvason, is the fact that some old simple people also seem to take part in the conversion. So we have more characters, and we also have simpler people from the community taking part in the conversion. Sometimes very tragically. There is one particular episode about a young boy who is actually killed by some pagan spirits, which reinforces this idea that conversion really needs to take place in order to abolish all these evil spirits. In Erbygja Saga, there are also very interesting episodes about the conversion, including the Walking Dead. We have one character, we have one character called Thorgunna, and Thorgunna is a Christian, and she actually comes back from the dead, not to scare people away, but to ensure that the household where her carriers stopped actually enjoy good food and shelter. So she is used in a cautionary tale. This is one way of using the Christian revenants in that kind of story. The tale of Thorvald the Far-Traveled is something also very interesting. So Thorvald, I mentioned earlier, is one of the people involved in conversion, and it is a story full of miraculous and supernatural happenings.
Okay.
So his father, for example, is a non-believer, and he says that he thought that there was this prophet living in a large and imposing stone close to his farm, and then Thorvald proposed to him a test. If the bishop, relying on the Christian God, could successfully drive this pagan spirit away, then Kodran would abandon him. So yeah, this is obviously very very supernatural way. And then we also have the Berserker challenge I mentioned before, and the fire miracle. So here in such a story, we are already on the territory on these more missionary hagiographical stories. And perhaps the last thing I would like to mention here are the Vinland sagas, the saga of Erik the Red and the Grönlandiga saga, because this is also a very interesting mix. It is told that Leif Erikson was sent to advocate Christianity at Brattahlid, presenting the message about the true Catholic Church on behalf of Olaf Tryggvason. But his father, Erik the Red, was not really thrilled about this, and he was very reluctant to giving his faith up. On the other hand, his wife, Theotild, she was quick to convert, and I think this speaks in more general manner about the role of women in a Christian conversion. And she actually decides to build a church very close to where they dwelt, and she also refused to sleep with Eric as long as he insisted on remaining a pagan. And speaking of revenants, there are also some revenant stories in these two sagas as well, very much related to this aspect of Christianization, in the sense of people coming back if they were not buried on consecrated ground. So in essence, such sagas would emphasize the practical and spiritual effects of the conversion. I mentioned Adam of Bremen before. He has a slightly different story because he represents an institution, which, is the Archbishopric of Hamburg-Bremen. And generally speaking, his entire story is not as much the conflict between pagans and Christians as it is the story of the conflict between pagans and this particular archbishopric. So even the ones who converted, if they were not in a way or another confirmed by this particular bishopric, they were still considered to be pagans. So he insists in the story that Isleifr, we kept mentioning, so the first bishop, was actually consecrated by Hamburg-Bremen, which is a piece of information that is missing from the Icelandic sources, especially in a source like Kristni Saga. I think that was done in the sense of insisting on this idea of the independent development of Iceland. In particular, Kristni Saga insists on the independence both from Hamburg-Bremen and from Norway. So
Okay.
this attempt to integrate it in a personalized national narrative, individual development. Yeah. And I would like to end this very brief presentation with a remark from an article by Sverre Jacobsen in 2019 with regard to the general trend observed across these narratives, in the sense that the story of conversion becomes increasingly inclusive over time. Because the first stories, if we refer to Icelandingabók, for example, they present a very limited story, so limited to a particular category of people, to the missionaries, for example, or to the few people, chieftains who adopted Christianity and the measures they take afterwards. And then the whole story tends to be extended to the entire populace, because we have stories such as Olafs Saga Tryggvassonar in Mesta, presenting a broader narrative and trying to integrate more people. So this is a sign that in a way or another, Christianity becomes very much embedded in the cultural memory of medieval Icelanders. So the general suspicion is here that we are dealing with a core story with some particular elements we have seen spread across all the sources, and in time these would have been harmonized. It is still a bit suspicious, the whole story, because it looks so tidy and neat and organized if you think about it. So that's why I think it would be a good starting point for us to continue with the archaeological sources, which might offer us a little more detail on what was actually going on.
Hmm. This is interesting, isn't it? About how we match up the history and the archaeology, because at one level, archaeologists have long discussed the fact that archaeology, while it seduces us into thinking it's a direct window on the past, it
Mm.
has so many layers of authorship and bias, survival of evidence, the choices made by people, that they're very much like the kind of the very similar challenges to interpreting the fragmentary historical sources. So I thought I would just wade in and reflect on the archaeological evidence by thinking about how we can approach archaeology and in terms of themes of death, memory, and Christian conversion. The dead did not bury themselves,
Mm-hmm.
and the way people are treated in death may not match our ideas of what criteria are today for a Christian burial, but also would have perhaps not necessarily mapped onto any contemporary perception of what makes a grave Christian. And we have to start, I suppose, by challenging the idea that Christians were obsessed from an early point with how their dead were treated. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that this is a bit of a historical, mythological narrative that we've concocted, which is not conclusively in the archaeological record, that burial was perhaps down the criteria the baptism was the most important. How you were buried, there's a lot of potential for continuing traditional practices, but not saying, well, they're not pagan. They are continuing those and the same practices, and therefore it's very difficult to pin down. And we are creating a bit of a false divide between pagan and Christian in trying to pin down in a process that may have taken many generations. But with that qualifier in mind, I want to sort of suggest there are two ways in which archaeology can approach the burial evidence in terms of Christian conversion. The first is trying to look for changes in funerary ritual that might be directly or indirectly connected to the economic, social, religious changes associated with Christian conversion. What is the actual evidence of changing ritual practices in response to this? And the second approach is, can the burial evidence help us think about the ways in which the pagan past, was remembered in the landscape, and not simply remembered in a chin-scratching, passive, oh, look over there, remember the graves of our ancestors type way. I'm talking about practical interventions, physical interventions in places, maybe acts of memory work, ways in which people connected to the past. So I thought I'd just quickly sort of think of those two ways we can approach the archaeology. And I suppose the first part is captured by the papers by Fredriksson and Vesteinsen, and then Schmidt et al., that try to look at the burial data and say, well, what happens, what changes with conversion? And I suppose some of the key points I gained from reading this is that there's a gradual abandonment of pagan traditional burial sites, not a moment of change, and that this is part of a long-term shift to parish churches controlled by chieftains and landowning farmers and adjacent to their farms over a period that may have started before the official conversion moment, but continue through the 10th century. So this is about 150 years, 6-7 generations, not a moment of, right, we're not doing this anymore with the dead, we're doing that.
Yeah, it would have been a much more complex. If I think about it, there are some interesting examples from the sagas as well. There is, for example, one man called Bui in Kjalnesinga saga, who he never made sacrifices, but is nevertheless taken to church, and he's buried under the church wall, but he's buried with his weapons. So kind of like that sort of thing, like mash up.
And the question is, is there anything in those sagas that explicitly says burial with weapons is pagan? Or is that our assumption? Because when you have some of the other sagas, they talk about burial with weapons. They don't do this kind of turn to a modern audience and go, and they did this because this was the way of their ancestors, and this is to honor the gods, and we put the comb in the grave to honor Sif, and we put the spear in the grave to honor Odin. There's nothing that tells us that this kind of level of precision of faith-based meaningful action was behind those choices. I'm not saying that they weren't. I'm just saying there's a heavy demand on us to find that precision of a sacrificed horse so that he can ride to Valhalla. No one's doing that kind of thing. And I think that's where I do like the TV show Vikings, because it equally leaves it hanging. Were they doing this because of religious motivations? And there's only a few individuals in the TV show that go down that route. Mm-hmm. And that's Floki, the hyper pagan, who, everything he does is for the gods. And so surprise, surprise, when he puts objects into Helga's grave, he tells stories linked to Norse mythology about the objects, but there's no evidence from our real sources to suggest. So I think that's a really interesting point about they want to bury him in a traditional way with weapons. That is remembered as something, but was it the case? Was it seen as a contradiction at the time?
I think they just accepted the contradiction because it was very hard to try to integrate their ancestors in the stories they were trying to tell. So there would have been a sort of like an accepted ambivalence in the memory of the past, I suppose.
So we have high status sites where we have early churches with burials, such as the site we've already addressed in previous videos, and we're going to discuss a little bit later, Hrísbrú, where you have a stave church with a graveyard constructed in the late 10th century based on our radiocarbon dating, suggesting a terminus postquem, dated after 960 to 1010. So that, if the later in that range is selected, that's a church established at the point of historical conversion as we know it from the sagas. But you could argue that it's possible that there were churches being put up in the decades immediately before that, and these were located next to a longhouse. So what this tells us, this evidence shows us, is that when Christian conversion is taking place, it's that close connection with chieftains and their farms, and they're putting the churches, as you'd expect, to be honest, right near their homes, so they are able to worship, display and show off publicly their connection to those rituals, and the dead
and control the cult.
And they're controlling the cult, there's evidence of this from pagan times too.
Absolutely.
So this is, they're following, the church is following, and frankly, the churches may look very much like what type of pagan temples they were constructing: small, wooden, elaborately decorated, and very much, not some radically different architecture, but very much following the tradition and the burials. But what would have been different though with the Christian church is that burial would have been connected to those buildings in a way, in a way that hasn't happened before. And so they talk about the fact that you've got some evidence, some hints of continuity of pre-Christian practice. And one idea they point out is in 5 of the burials from Hrísbrú, they have clench bolts that are from ships. Now, when we find these in Anglo-Saxon context, there's the most likely scenario of what you're seeing here is bits of reused boats and ships deployed as grave architecture. So I would be more hesitant to see this as a pagan continuity, because this may be more about the reuse of timber to create structures to contain the dead, coffins and chests, and so I'm not convinced that means a continuing pagan symbolism of afterlife journeying by water, but it does show an overlap. And the other thing that we do see, and we're going to come back to this from a different angle, is secondary burials translated from pagan burial sites. And this is paralleled in Egil's saga, where we have the hero exhumed. But we have other examples of secondary graves, and we have this also from Greenland too. And this may be to do with, in part, people that die away from home, lost at sea as mariners. But in some cases, it may be to do with burials that were in pagan field cemeteries, and then they are exhumed within years, decades, we don't know, and reburied on consecrated ground. And it's only according to Fridriksson and Vesteinson, it's really only in the 12th and 13th century that we see the consolidation of a church administration and parish churches. So if you're thinking about a process, you've got Christian presence and influence before official conversion, you've got establishment of churches, translation of old burials of ancestors into these churches, burial of the newly dead in these churches and churchyards, and then you've got a reorganization within the 200 years gap. And so they say there's an unhelpful dichotomy of pagan versus Christian. Many can't really be seen to be either. When you've got furnishings, you can say, oh, well, this may be a traditional practice, but many graves don't have artifacts, and so you could see them as pagan or Christian. They identified that we've got archaeologically two types of pagan burials, outside homesteads and those farther away on boundaries between farms, but both are associated with roots. So the idea of these pre-Christian burials is that their performances, their theatrical displays for public consumption, for public participation, but then they were also installed in places where either near farms or beyond, where travelers would encounter them. We've lost superstructures, but we can imagine, as we talked about before, various grave houses, burial mounds, and many of them, they note, are out of sight from the settlements they belong to, but within, accessible, visible from routes connecting settlements. And there may be they make the point that there's chronological shifts possible, and multiple burial locations may have been used by a community at the same time. We should not assume there were single farm burial grounds. There may be a whole host of different practices going on. Before you have churches, there's nothing saying you have to have one burial ground. Maybe you have a whole series of locations. While they're most likely used by the households and farms, it may be more complicated. And we've got around 170 locations now, and we can sort of map these against the late 17th century farm valuations, which allows us to think about how Iceland, by the 10th, 11th century, we can use the later sources to try and understand, well, where are these burials in relation to the churches? And they make the point that we would expect pagan cemeteries or pre-Christian cemeteries to be on all the farms, irrespective of their size. And what they're able to show is that the Christian cemeteries seem to be at a very different geographical location, and that they're closer to the settlement. They're inside the home field boundary, almost always on the home farm. And that, many of the churches that are established are, in numerical terms, on the farm mound. And it's almost, it's just over 2/3. And 102 are elsewhere close by, and only 16, which seem to be associated with roadside chapels, are elsewhere. So what they're talking about is a changing geography of burial that brings the dead closer to the living, not because, and this is the point I want to emphasize, not because the pagans shunned the dead or didn't want to be associated with the dead. It's more that there's a connection to the farm in this period. So Fridriksson and Versteinson argue that the Christian cemeteries are almost always on the farm mound, and that they are very rarely not associated with settlement. And this is not to say that pagan period graves are feared, shunned, and isolated, but that there's a specific draw of the Christian dead to be at the farm locations. And it's estimated that around 45% of churches and chapels to farms have been identified, and almost all of the farms had their own cemeteries in pagan times. But in Christian times, numbers were drastically reduced, with small farms most likely to close theirs. And they suggest three scenarios for this change. New churches built, then abandoned by the 14th century. And there are some examples where this seems to apply. So there's a phase of church building, but then they're abandoned. The continuation of burial in pre-Christian cemeteries may have taken place, or there's a negotiated burial in neighbour cemeteries by churches. In other words, people start to move towards churches, and they see this as a long-term trend with towards fewer burial grounds. And it's still not clear exactly the speed and character involved. Were there intermediate stages? Were there people moving? It wasn't just a pagan to Christian. Was there, churches in between? And was it varying locally? It's about they're trying to look at, with the evidence available, there's the honest truth that we can't always define precision, even when we have tephrochronology that allows us to give sort of horizons of volcanic ash that allows us to date our activities before and after, there's many areas where those ash layers don't occur, and when they do occur, they're only giving us sort of broad parameters. But they're trying to say that in general terms, there's a social and political consolidation tied to religious cohesion, and there's a shift from burial as a liminal space and burial on the borders to burial that's central and to do with habitation. I mean, I'm not totally. What I've already said really is I don't quite buy that. Just that they say, oh, it's complicated and a slow process, but they still want this pagan versus Christian transition. My concern is that this isn't necessarily a move from the dead being marginalized from the world of the living to their inclusion in the world of the living. It's more about how burial and memory of the dead is integral to the church architecture and the burial ground. And that's not necessarily the same thing, because by having the dead close to the living in the farm doesn't mean that before they were nowhere to be seen and nowhere to be witnessed. They're just not on the routes out and around the landscape. So they basically map this, and they're trying to make the point based on later farm valuations that pagan burials are found in all farm locations. So there's no difference, but there is a difference between the valuations of the farms with chapels and cemeteries. So that uptick here is the fact that churches and chapels are at the more wealthy farms, as valued later. But I think that gives us a crude indication. So what they're saying is that it's the wealthy farms that get the churches and chapels, and people start to want to be buried at them. So the dead become concentrated into the church chapel sites at the wealthier farm sites, and that allows a degree of control. So there may have been a few early chapels and churches built at high status farmsteads, but over time that tradition develops. And
so
the recent,
we have a concentration of power that essentially encouraged the formation of a new type of communal identity, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, I think that's what we seem to be. I think that's what we're saying. It's not to say that the dead weren't important, the dead were marginalized before. It's more about that concentration of social and political power linked to the religious administration that by the 13th and 14th centuries had become consolidated. So there's a conversion process, but there's also in terms of burial necrogeography, if you like, it's a money stage process. And Schmidt et al. In their more recent study look at the combination of radiocarbon dating from burials with tephrochronology. And their overall interpretation, as far as I understand it, is that Christian burial may begin earlier than first thought and run alongside late pagan burial sites from the late 10th century, 1 or 3 generations before a Christian official conversion. There's no single shift, there's local patterns. Now, I have some reservations about this argument, because there's a bit of a circular argument in how you identify a Christian burial. Is that Christian burials are the burials without grave goods, without the horse sacrifice. And so I'm not disparaging their entire study. I'm just think there's a risk of being circular about the arguments, that you're saying, oh look, these are findless burials and they're earlier than thought, they must be Christian burials. That shows that Christian burials are earlier than we thought. But what if those are pagan burials, but they didn't, for any whatever reason, circumstances, wealth, identity, they did not want to be buried with those artifacts and those sacrificial deposits. And they make the point that this may be linked to preceding a general reorganizations of farms from the mid 11th century. They're suggesting there may already be a complex interleaving of pagan and Christian practice. So I just wanted to give you that sort of snapshot of the archaeological record does show us a shift of location and practice in treating the dead, but it's there may be overlap and stages of processes of centralization of the dead, or the dead drawing together to church locations, that may only work themselves through over centuries. And the second way of looking at the archaeology is what does the archaeology tell us about the remembrance of the pagan dead in the Christian world? As we mentioned before, the idea that some of these sources reference burial mounds, and these saga literature of the 13th century, they want to give some of that detail of how famous saga heroes are interred or honor their family, suggesting it was really important to remember the pagan dead. And
Yeah, I think
because
that's also very much reflected in the very late sagas, like the legendary sagas, where you have heroes going on a quest to enter the mounds of these ancient kings that lived at some point. That's some sort of cultural memory that was preserved about how the ancestors were buried, like the important ancestors were buried, and they really want to interact with them.
So can we see any of that in the actual archaeological record? And this is where I want to go back to Erlands and Bajok and Zori's work on at the Hrisbru site, because for me, there's two obvious options for looking at this. They focus on Egil's grave, what they think may be the grave, maybe. But as usual, I'm skeptical about trying to literally lock down archaeology from history. But even if it isn't Egil's grave, it's really intriguing case study. But before I get to that, they don't talk about this, so I don't think they've published on this. But I would like to look at their evidence that we've already talked about of this unique cremation, the first and only cremation deposit we have from the site of Hrisbru. And I want to just point out that their excavations at this site reveal these two sites of, again, forgive my pronunciation, Holdehol and Kirkjehol. These two sites are literally only 40 meters or 50 meters apart, two little knolls. And on the natural boat-shaped hillock that's modified, they find a cremation burial with a curb around it. So what I'm trying to get at is that they discuss this as evidence of pre-Christian cremation practice is actually happening in Iceland, with the argument that there's no fuel for cremation. Well, firstly, this proves that wrong. Secondly, there's lots of different things you can use to burn fuel. You can use seaweed, you can use peat, you don't need massive piles of large chunky timbers to cremate human remains. Cremation is a complex process, but you can use a range of flammable materials to do the job. So the idea that cremation is rare in Iceland suggests that the environment worked against it, it lent against it, that it was too difficult. But the fact there's cremation there shows that can't be the whole picture, that if you wanted to cremate somebody, then you could. And we also know from some of those sagas of revenants coming back that it was seen as a last resort. And that, if you wanted...
that's very specific, though. I mean, I've always wondered about that, because that's one of the classical explanations, because the revenants come back in, the Walking Dead are very much present in Iceland, precisely because the Icelanders allegedly did not have the possibility to cremate, and therefore you had all these inhumated people lying around. Therefore the fear.
I mean, it doesn't quite work, because we know that in many parts of Scandinavia, inhumation is happening too, particularly in the later Viking Age. So it's kind of, but and what I want to get at here, this is totally, you can say this is total speculation, but what I want to make the point at is that this deposit is that I talked about in a previous video, was on a prominent knoll only tens of meters away from, it's an isolated grave. There's a question of how common these are. We've missed it. The lack of wood is not an explanation. And is this, and the Zori et al. Argue, could this be a late pagan burial, a coexistence, or a backlash? But I would just like to make the point that we often associate cremation with dissolution, destruction, fragmentation, but I would argue this would be a prominent ritual that would have been remembered through the knoll and the location. And while we don't know exactly how this relates to that later saga literature, this was literally a spear's throw, literally, from this Hrisbru complex on the next knoll along of a hall and a Christian church. So I suppose what I'm trying to get at is this stylization by Fredrickson and Vesteinson that the pagan dead were out dispersed and then the Christian dead were brought together. Well, maybe in general terms over the long term, but when you look at a site like this, you have to imagine that the people who are using that church for inhumation would have been aware of the pagan past literally within a 2-minute walk of these sites. These Christian chapels are being established in landscapes of the pagan dead, and I don't think they would have perhaps, that intimacy was already there, and rather than seeing that knoll and that cremation burial as somehow long forgotten, they may have just that. I wonder if that connection may have been really important for the land claims, for the identities. Yeah. And so this church is not over the pagan grave, but is literally close by it. So that's the first point. That's the first way that could question, not assertion, could the memory of the pagan dead be manifest in our archaeological evidence here in showing the close proximity of the farm, the hall, this grand hall, a church, a small church with burials around it, and then the burial mounds, of which probably there were more, but we haven't excavated them. There would have been many burial mounds encircling this area. And then this leads us to the second piece of evidence that they do themselves review. Do we have Egil Skallagrimsson's grave here at because we know that Egil was interred 3 times. He had 3 locations, right? So we know he died in around 919, was buried in a mound in sight of the farm. And that underpins the point I've already made, that he was buried close to the farm, not on the liminal periphery as seems to be stylized by some of the archaeologists, right? He's buried near this farm, but in around the year 1000, Grimir builds a church at this site, and Egil's stepdaughter, Thordis, do you say Thordis or Thordis? I don't know. Thordis, right? She commands his body is exhumed and reinterred in the new church. And it's remembered in the saga as being buried beneath the altar. And in the mid-12th century, so you're looking at sort of 150 years later, roughly, they build a new church 500 meters, half a kilometer east, and at that point, for a second time, Egil's bones are exhumed and reburied in the new church, but not before this priest called Skarpti gets exhausted trying to break the skull open on the church wall with an axe. Now, why he does this is perhaps something you can illuminate about. But is this a story about disrespect for the pagan ancestors, or more about testing the metal of the toughness of his skull? And there's all sorts of discussions about that, but my point is that when they excavated the site of the small mound known as Kirkjuhold, the church knoll, or the church, is that the right way of interpreting that? They found the church.
The hill of the church, yeah.
Yeah, the hill of the church. They found this 7 meter by 3 meter small chapel, and they found a hole in the floor of the chancel identified without human remains within, and they suggest, could this have been Egil's grave, the second grave? He had his pagan grave, we haven't found that. He's exhumed and placed within 10 years of his death in a Christian grave beneath the chancel of this first church, and there's another feature nearby that could be evidence of other reburials of a disarticulated skeleton. So it's not just Egil; other people may have been exhumed and reburied, and then later they dig it up again. So this, during the excavation, they've labelled it here, which I always makes me wince, because we don't know if it's Egil's grave, but it's such a tantalizing possibility that we may have dug up Egil's second grave, the one where he rested for 150 years between his exhumation from a pagan burial mound to the first church, before the priest exhumed him, tried to break his skull open with an axe, and then reburied him as an honoured ancestor, and this is a character who's remembered as not exactly the most lovely and cheerful and happy man, but as someone who is definitely remembered, worthy of
Yeah,
being,
maybe not as honored as we might think if
yeah,
someone tried to break his skull with an
yeah,
axe.
you
But
know, but
I will have to
almost like
recheck a bit the
yeah, go
saga.
on.
But as far as I remember, he was buried by the outer edge of the church. I have to check this.
Yeah, so there's an
It's
ambivalence there, isn't there? There's
yeah.
a sense that he's almost like being treated like a freak show. And it's not the kind of memory that perhaps we would see as remember our glorious saint.
Yeah,
It's
he
not
was a very
exactly.
ambivalent character. I think I could
Yeah,
see it in death as well.
exactly. But does this tell us something in the material about the very processes we find in the Icelandic sagas, the oral traditions that then get written down? Is that there's an ongoing negotiation at local farms with those mounds, those
Hmm.
early church sites. It's not pagan versus Christian, it may be a more complex sequence, but they're thinking through their local landscape, and they're very much trying to write stories through mounds, and the mounds are a part of the negotiation of memory, and sometimes the exhumation processes are part of the stories. And we have other sagas which record the discovery of, someone has a bad dream in a church. Is that Njol saga? Or I can't remember, where they have a bad dream in a church and they dig up and they find the remains of a witch. And there's this connection to the dead. The dead are there in the immediate landscape, and
How
they
was
can
someone
be.
finding a prophetess under their bed?
That's it. Yeah, but you have this. I suppose my general point is that there's two sides of looking at the archaeology. There's we can use archaeology to track conversion in a crude sense, that's possible, and we can see changes in burial location and burial treatment. And the second way is to think about how can we explore the archaeology to help think about changing memory,
Yeah.
changing relationships between the living and the dead, in the way that the stories are told through oral tradition, but also negotiated through digging up the dead and translating the dead, and remembering those pagan ancestors in a Christian context, not always in a benevolent way or in a positive way, but still, I wonder how much that's part of the story of these communities, how they remembered their past and defined their identities in their local landscape. So that's what I thought I would share from an archaeological point of view that may be of interest. And
Yeah,
I
I think that's a very good addition, and I think the two parts we presented actually fit very well this puzzle, as it's still in the end a puzzle, but
course,
it's worth wondering about, as you said, how these communities would have negotiated themselves the past, because in in the written sources, we always have this problem of presenting from the side of power relationships, institutional perspectives, monopolizing and controlling religions, but how the communities themselves perceived themselves and renegotiated their identity in time, that's I think more interesting than this
yes.
very institutionalized perspective. Yeah.
And as usual, archaeology isn't simply the evidence behind the stories. Often it is showing us the way people are making those stories. They're creating those stories through the physical
Right.
practices, the engagement with old places and materials and monuments.
Yeah, this whole complexity actually reminded me of an artifact, the wolf cross from Foss. As that
Yeah.
mix, it's like half a cross and half wolf. And I think this summarizes in a way what we've discussed from this point of view of the mix between paganism and Christianity, because this was an artifact that was largely interpreted as, the victory of Christianity over paganism. But then we can also interpret it as some sort of way of bringing maybe the two together. In a way, I think these people were also thinking very practically. There's always an example I really enjoy from the Book of Settlements. It's Helgi the Lean, who prays to Jesus when he is on land. Then when he is at sea, he prays to Thor. And I, I think it's brilliant. I mean, the way you can adapt to these whole new
Yeah.
realities.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And it's so human to see the
yeah,
hypocrisies or inconsistencies, or how everyone's negotiating their own way through the world
right.
in times of change.
Yeah. We just want these stories to be coherent.
Yeah,
Sometimes they're not, like
yeah,
often
yeah.
they're not. Yeah, but that makes them actually more fascinating. So I think we're going to wrap it up here.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for watching or listening, and I hope you are going to join us in the future episodes with more interesting and similar topics. Thank you so much.